Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Somnolent Stories. Tonight, we walk softly into the quiet shadows of the ancient world, into a city where marble glowed in the lamplight, and the air carried both the hum of the marketplace and the stillness of candlelit chambers. We drift into the hidden Rome, a place where power moved not only on the battlefield, but in the delicate exchange of secrets. And in the unhurried steps of those who watched and listened. What you will hear tonight is not imagined fiction, but threads of history preserved in fading ink, in careful inscriptions, and in the quiet patterns of lives once lived. They are echoes from long ago, carried gently into the present. Before you settle in, I invite you to softly tap the like button, and subscribe only if these calm journeys we take together feel like a place you would wish to return to. I would love to know where in the world you're listening from and what hour of the night or early morning finds you here. It is always a quiet joy to see our small night-traveling community connecting across oceans, mountains, and time zones, now dim. The lights perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle, steady hum. And let us begin. Here on Somnolent Stories, we move slowly, letting the past unfold at a pace that allows your mind to wander wherever it wishes to go. When we think of the ancient Roman world, it's easy to see it in sharp, bright images. The tall eagle, standards of the legions, catching the sunlight in their golden wings. The long, cool shadow of the Colosseum, its arches holding centuries of quiet stories. The marble forums, where senators once strolled slowly, their words drifting into the warm air. We picture a civilization built on order, shaped by careful layers of law and tradition, and bound together by the steady strength of its armies. Roman writers encouraged this vision. They spoke of honor, and of the disciplined gladius resting at the soldier's side. They told of courage on the battlefield and the unyielding loyalty of the legionnaire. But this is only the surface. Beneath it, another world stirred quietly. A different kind of war. One with no open fields, no grand charges, and no banners raised high. Instead, it unfolded in shaded alleyways, in the murmurs of the marketplace, and in candlelit corridors, heavy with incense and quiet voices. It was a war not of swords, but of whispers, a slow, patient contest of secrets, collected, traded, and hidden away in the Romans. Patient, practical, ambitious, understood that power was not only taken by force, it could be shaped in silence, guided by unseen hands. At the heart of this quiet struggle, history remembers a shadowed figure, a presence moving gently between worlds, never entirely seen, yet always there. Tonight, we will walk softly into that hidden Rome, the Rome of secret messages and unseen watchers. And perhaps, as the story unfolds, you may find yourself drifting with it into the stillness of the ancient night. In the vast machine that was Rome, some men were born into greatness, others clawed their way toward it quietly, deliberately, step by step. But there were those who neither sought fame nor fortune, and yet found themselves at the center of history. One such man might have been Lucius, a common legionary, one face among thousands, marching in step, eating from the same iron bowl, sleeping under the same heavy sky. He was not the strongest. He did not shout the loudest or boast after victories, but there was something in his gaze, a calmness, an attentiveness, a stillness like a surface of water beneath which currents never ceased. And it was that stillness Rome noticed. Selection. In silence, there was no call to arms for the speculators. No banners, no trumpet. Their recruitment was quiet, like them, A centurion might observe a soldier for months, not for his muscle, but for how he watched the world. Did he notice details others missed? Could he wait without twitching, endure without complaint, vanish without drawing a single glance? If so, one day that soldier would be summoned, not to the parade grounds, but to a quiet tent behind the command pavilion. There, a superior would ask questions without asking. A conversation that probed more than it revealed. If the man answered correctly, not just with words, but with instinct, he would be offered a choice to leave behind the known, to walk away from the structured rhythm of legion life, and step instead into shadow. The mind of a spy, the ideal. Candidate was not a brute. He was a listener. A man who remembered faces, voices, silences. A man who could tell the difference between a drunk stumble and a feigned one. He might know another language. He might be good with his hands, but above all, he was invisible in plain sight. The best speculators were those you could not remember, even moments after you spoke to them, once chosen. The transformation began. Lucius quickly learned that strength alone would not carry him through shadow. The most dangerous battles were not fought with blades, but with thoughts. In silence, doubts grew louder. In isolation, loyalty was tested. In disguise, identity began to blur. He sometimes wondered if he played a lie long enough. Would he forget the truth? But this, too, was part of the training. The instructors, those nameless men of the dark, taught him how to stay rooted, not in who he was, but in why he had chosen this path. He repeated oaths in his mind like prayers. He practiced breathing techniques to calm the storm of uncertainty. Some days, they said nothing to him at all, just left him in an unfamiliar room with only a cloak, a scroll, and silence. The lesson: adaptation, reflection, endurance, he learned. To listen to the wind, to taste tension in a room, to know when eyes were watching, even if they never blinked. The quiet brotherhood, he was not entirely alone. From time to time, he trained alongside others. There were no names, only gestures, only trust. They practiced signals together, a tap of the heel, a cough at the right time, a coin placed heads down. These small rituals became a kind of language, shared only between ghosts. They didn't ask about the past. They didn't speak of the future. Their bond was not forged in laughter, but in silence. A brotherhood of watchers. Each man was a mirror, reflecting nothing and everything. Initiation in darkness, the final stage, was neither test nor trial. It was surrender. Lucius was led, blindfolded, into a chamber lit by oil lamps. No words were spoken. Only a symbol was pressed into his palm. A mark made not with ink, but with heat, not to brand him. He would always carry a mission. He would always carry a mission, even when none was given. Even when peace surrounded him, he would walk through the empire as its silent breath. Not to conquer, but to observe. Not to rule, but to remember. And then, just like that, it was done. He emerged from the tent not as Lucius the legionary, but as no one at all. He would have no rank, no recognition, no home. His only identity was purpose. The first mission. The first mission was never simple, not because it was complicated, but because it was real. No instructors, no safety net. He was sent to a port town in Illyricum, cover, a scribe escorting merchant goods. His task: observe a dockmaster suspected of arming local rebels. no contact, no aid, no room for error. He remembered the sound of the gulls, the creak of ropes on mast, the smell of salt and fish. He remembered the way his hands trembled as he faked a shipping document for the first time. He remembered watching the target speak to a cloaked man and pretending not to see. He remembered how hard it was not to act, not to intervene, but simply to watch, because that was the mission. To see, to remember, and to vanish. A new life begins. That mission was just the beginning. In the years that followed, Lucius would wear many names, many faces, many loyalties. He would be invited into homes and know the floor plans better than the owners. He would sit beside kings, and learn their fears. He would sleep on straw and wake with knowledge worth more than gold. But through it all, he would carry the same stillness in his eyes, the stillness of a man who saw too much, said too little, and remembered everything. He was a speculator now, and the shadows were home. Training beyond the body, Lucius, like others before him, was already strong. He could march across deserts. He could fight, dig, lift, endure. But this training was different. He was taught how to move through a crowd without being noticed. How to study a marketplace, not with his eyes, but with his ears. How to sit still for hours, breathing shallow, watching a gate, a door, a single flickering lamp. They trained in the art of silence, in how to breathe through tension, how to lie convincingly, and how to wear another man's skin, not just in clothing, but in behavior, posture, tone. He learned to memorize entire maps without ink or parchment, to track conversations without writing a word. His mind became a ledger, a scroll no enemy could seize. They were taught the patience of stone and the flexibility of water. Becoming someone else's disguise was not a costume. It was a transformation. Lucius learned how to darken his skin with walnut stain, how to wear his hair like a local laborer, how to shift the way he walked, sometimes dragging one leg, sometimes with the bowed head of a pious traveler. He practiced accents until his own voice felt foreign. He studied not just languages, but the rhythms, gestures, and taboos that made each culture unique. A Gallic dialect, a Germanic insult, a Greek proverb. Each could save or end a mission. And so, he studied like a priest, practiced like an actor, and endured like a soldier. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. Lucius had to let go of his identity, not fully, but enough to wear another convincingly. He became, for a time, a merchant, a slave, a messenger, a grieving brother, a deserter, a man looking for work, a man looking for redemption, a man looking for nothing. Each version of himself, crafted with care, each one believable, each one disposable. The weight of waiting. Not every mission was filled with movement. Some were weeks of watching, a locked door, single window, a pattern of guards. Lucius might sit in a stable for 5 nights listening to whispered conversations between servants. He might loiter at a well to observe which trader arrived with which cart. He learned the rhythms of other people's lives, and in their patterns, he found their secrets. He learned that humans rarely notice the background, and that the speculator must become exactly that background. He was the shadow that moved when no one watched, the presence no one recalled. Tools of the trade he carried little. A coin, a ring with a hidden seal, a blade that could vanish into a sleeve. But his real weapons were mental. He learned codes, not just letters, but gestures, a way of tying sandals, a way of touching the left ear, A phrase spoken twice in a sentence. To the average ear, nothing. To another speculator, a signal. He was taught how to forge letters, how to slip notes into loaves of bread, how to pass messages inside knots or within patterns in woven cloth. Even silence, when crafted well, could deliver meaning. The ritual of vanishing there was a ceremony, but not the kind most Romans knew. No laurel crowns, no cheers, just a quiet oath, spoken in candlelight, before a man whose name would never be written. And from that moment, Lucius belonged to a world most Romans would never see. He was not erased. He was transformed. The life he left behind became a shell, and from it, a shadow emerged. He would walk through cities that called themselves free. He would listen in halls carved from stone. He would drink with rebels, kneel with priests, fight with bandits, and vanish before dawn. Each day, he would remember who he was, and each night he would let it go. Because in the service of Rome, his face was not his own. He was now a mirror, a mask, a message. Some missions were loud. Most were not. The life of a speculator rarely unfolded with clash or chaos. It flowed quietly like a river beneath ice, slow, patient, and unrelenting. It began in silence, as always. Morning, in disguise, the town was small, tucked between two wooded hills in northern Gaul. Stone streets damp with dew. Smoke curling lazily from chimney holes. Dogs barking in the distance. Lucius opened his eyes before dawn, as he always did. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar, low, timbered, stained with the breath of years. He lay on a straw mat in a room above a baker's shop, a rented space. No one knew his name. And that was exactly how it should be. Today, he was not Lucius. He was Brennus, an expert in the trade of hides, a native Gaul, serenely born close to the banks of the river, commanding the attention of Roman purchasers with his exceptional offerings of leather goods. He dressed in a garment customized with local earth colors, and his hands were meticulously treated with a mixture of ashes and grease to gently prepare the skin. His vocal tone carried the distinct local flavor, while his hair remained untouched and simply braided. Maintaining the traditional practices of the community, his identity was not a story. It was a skin, slipping into the day he moved through. The town slowly, purposefully, not searching, but listening. He nodded to the woman who sold eggs, chattering pleasantly to the man selling pottery, refrained from making any serious statements about the rising prices, concentrating on Roman taxes, the antics of soldiers who often indulged in excessive drinking and paid little attention to their duties. Each word was a thread, each reaction a knot or an opening. He noticed the way one merchant crossed his arms too quickly, the way another looked to the side before answering. It wasn't about what people said. It was about the air that changed around them when certain names were mentioned. That morning, one name hung heavier than others: Vercingetorix, the rebel, the unifier of tribes. The thorn in Caesar's side, and perhaps, in this town, a hero. Watching without seeing, Lucius made his way to the market square. Children ran between stalls. A woman argued over the weight of flour. Goats bleated. A Roman soldier leaned against a post, disinterested, bored. But Lucius noticed something else. 3 men at a table, not eating, just watching. Their clothes were plain, but their boots too. New, their faces passive, but their posture alert. Fellow watchers, perhaps. but not his kind. He turned away before they noticed his glance. Down an alley, a child ran past, shouting about a game. Lucius followed, pretending not to notice the conversation he passed. Shipment goes tomorrow. South Road. Tell him not to be late. That was enough. A phrase. A direction. A hint, he filed it away. Asterisk, the contact, just before noon. He met a man. At a well, no words were exchanged. Only a nod, a hand brushing over a wooden pail, and a coin dropped too slowly into a bucket. Later, in his room, Lucius examined the coin. Inside the wax seal, a sliver of parchment. 3 names, 1 symbol, and a message in shorthand only a trained eye could decode. His role had just shifted from listener to thread puller. Threads of the web, thirged of the way, locals suspected of organizing supply routes to revel camps. Lucius began to observe. He watched their routines. When they left home, whom they spoke with. How they carried themselves when they thought no one was watching. He didn't confront, didn't follow too closely, didn't ask questions. Asterisk Lucius continued on the road that led away from the village. It curved gently between fields lined with low stone walls, then dipped into a shallow valley covered in heather and mist. He didn't look back. A speculator never did. To turn and gaze behind was to court sentiment, and sentiment had no place in the work he did. Still, the images clung to him. The slow rhythm of the market, the glint of suspicion in a rebel's eye, the sound of that sack being exchanged behind the granary. He saw them again and again in his mind, not to regret, but to remember. Everything must be remembered. At a crossroads, he paused. There was an inn nearby, a low, smoky place where soldiers passed through, and locals kept their distance. He stepped inside, head bowed, face shadowed beneath his hood. He ordered a drink, sat in a corner, and watched, always watching. The toll of stillness every mission took something, not blood, not bone, but still, something. Lucius could feel the weight of it. Not like armor, not like fear, more like a presence pressed against the back of the mind, a tension that never truly left, even in rest. The longer he served, the quieter he became, not by choice, by necessity. Too much talk invited attention. Too much expression invited recognition. Too much presence invited danger. So he learned to blend into the walls, to become like old furniture seen, but unimportant. The perfect disguise was becoming forgettable. A life without applause, there would be no praise. No coin pressed into his palm. No laurel wreath waiting in Rome. Even his superiors would not know the full depth of what he'd seen. His success would be swallowed by silence, and yet that was the measure of the work. To vanish was to succeed. To be unmissed was to be perfect. To leave no trace was the highest honor. He did not envy the generals. He did not crave the power of senators. He belonged to a quieter world, a world of margins and messages, of signs and silences, a world of truths too dangerous to say aloud. The eternal cycle by the next morning. He would have a new name, a new mission, a new town, perhaps. It's a new cover. To wear like a second skin, another performance, another invisible stage. He would begin again, because that is what the speculators did. They began again and again, until their real names faded even from their own memories, and all that remained was purpose. A quiet oath, a slow breath, a shadow cast in the service of empire. He became a shadow on the edge of vision. The man who always seemed to be one table over, one stall behind, one face in a passing crowd. Each evening, he returned to his small room. He wrote nothing. He memorized everything. Names, times, movements, pauses in speech, looks exchanged in silence. His mind, trained through months of mental discipline, became a living scroll. He would replay the day again and again before sleep, until it was etched in thought. Temptation of action on the third day, he saw it. A hidden exchange behind the granary. A sack passed from one man to another, too small for grain, too heavy for cloth. Weapons, perhaps, or coin, or sealed letters. He felt the urge to act, to intervene, to stop what might be betrayal in real time, but he did not, because that was not the mission. His job was not to prevent. It was to observe, to confirm, to report, to disappear. He clenched his fists in the pocket of his cloak and turned away, alone. Among the many, the hardest part was not the waiting, the lying, not even the constant danger. It was the solitude, being surrounded by life, laughter, argument, commerce, and knowing none of it belonged to him. He could not laugh too freely, could not speak too deeply, could not care too much. Attachment was exposure. The speculator could not afford to be known, so Lucius practiced being distant without seeming rude, interested without revealing interest, a mask worn not once, but every moment he walked. The silent report on the 5th day, his mission ended. He left at dawn. Without a word, at the edge of town, he buried a wooden token beneath a marked tree. The token contained a carved sequence known only to those trained. A local contact would retrieve it, carry it onward. The information would flow, hand to hand, until it reached the command tent of a Roman general. Lucius never saw where. His message ended. That wasn't his role. His task was now complete. He had seen. He had remembered. He had vanished. Reflection in transit on the road out, he walked alone. The wind moved through the trees like whispered thoughts. Birds darted between branches. A cart creaked in the distance. No one followed. No one looked. Baghdadi was just another traveler, another stranger between towns. And yet, his mind carried more weight than any pack. He had memorized a conspiracy, tracked its flow, lined its players, and no one would know. Not the men in the square, not the baker, not the soldier at the post. His name would not be spoken. His actions would not be written. But Rome would move, because he had watched, because he had waited, because he had disappeared. Some men went to war with swords, others with scrolls. For the speculator, the sharpest weapon was invisibility in the empire of laws and legions, where stone cities rose and armies marched with mechanical precision. There existed another realm, quiet world, a world of illusion and coded breath. It was a place without uniforms, without fanfare, without names etched in marble. Yet it was the place from which Rome listened and sometimes whispered back. Disguise was not deception, it was identity. To disappear into another life was not a trick. It was an art. Lucius had learned early that people do not see what they expect not to see. A poor man with a limp, forgettable. A servant with downcast eyes, invisible. Ah, a traveler offering bread and a smile. Welcomed and never questioned. He became all of these. Sometimes within the same day, he dyed his tunic with crushed berries or dusted it with ash. He rubbed dirt into his skin until it looked weathered and sunburnt. He carried religious trinkets appropriate to the region, a small carved symbol of a local god, a twisted ring believed to bring luck, nothing that stood out. Everything that blended in. Disguise was not about costumes. It was about believability, about subtle layering, about knowing when to speak, and more importantly, when to remain still. Messages in plain sight communication was the second weapon. A whisper could be intercepted. A letter could be seized. But a pattern stitched into cloth, a phrase hidden in a merchant's ledger, that could pass through cities, through customs, through enemy camps. Lucius used steganography, the practice of hiding messages in ordinary things. He had once received a message hidden in the placement of items on a tavern shelf. Another time, a list of names was embedded in the pattern of a woven sash. The key was subtlety. Sometimes the angle of a tied sandal or a coin left heads down was enough to trigger action from another trained eye. Nothing was accidental. Every placement, every gesture, every pause part of the code. The written word, but never obvious when ink was used. It had to be clever. Invisible ink made from lemon and vinegar. Letters that seemed innocent until held to a flame. Sentences written in reverse, mirrored for decoding. But Lucius preferred safer methods. He once memorized an entire letter because writing it, quote, meant death if caught. Memory was more secure than paper. And he had trained his mind like a vault, no lock, no key, only discipline. Networks in shadow. Lucius was never truly alone, though it often felt that way, behind the scenes. Rome had constructed an internal network, a web of couriers, observers, and informants known as the frumentari. Originally grain collectors, they had become something far more dangerous. They traveled openly. On paper, they handled supply reports, food quotas, and local inventory. But underneath, they were Rome's eyes and ears. A speculator like Lucius might pass a whispered detail to a merchant who passed it to a frumentarius, who passed it again till it reached the right hands in Rome. Each link knew only what was necessary, saw the full web, and that was the brilliance of it. Silent language, they spoke through silence as much as sound. Lucius knew how to place his hand on a table to signal a meeting point, how to pause before lighting a lamp to mean danger, how to walk a certain path through a market to invite a handoff. Without speaking, signals could be anything. The fold of a sleeve, the direction of a look, even the tilt of a drinking cup. This language of gesture was sacred, passed from one shadow to another, each man fluent in meaning, but never explaining it aloud. The role of the informant, not all information came from observation. Sometimes it had to be drawn out. Lucius learned to spot the vulnerable, a merchant in debt, a local official hiding an affair, servant angry over poor pay. He did not need to threaten. Most people, when nudged gently with coin, kindness, or clever listening, gave more than they intended. He offered protection, solutions, or sometimes just a sympathetic ear, and in return, he received names, routes, timetables, the cost, their trust. But that too was part of the job. The moral mask, it was easy. In the beginning, to justify every choice, he served Rome. He preserved order. He prevented war. But with time, the lines blurred. When you lie each day, even for good reasons, truth begins to lose its edge. Lucius learned to live with masks, not just on his face, but in his heart. he asked himself fewer questions. Because the answers rarely brought comfort, he had seen men broken by guilt. He chose detachment instead, a clean, emotionless space where action could live without conscience, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Crafting the exit a mission was never truly over until you disappeared from it completely. Lucius practiced his exits with as much care as his entry. He might fake illness, stage a robbery, create a diversion with coin and rumor. Sometimes he left behind a different version of himself, a trace that suggested he had traveled in the opposite direction. A breadcrumb trail meant to confuse, not lead. The point was to vanish without leaving a hole. He didn't want people wondering where he'd gone. He wanted them to forget he had ever arrived. The weight of knowledge, there was a burden in knowing so much, not just secrets, but the quiet things. He knew which towns were nearing revolt, which governors were lying to. Rome, which temples were being used for hidden meetings. He carried facts that could change lives, destroy families, spark wars, and yet he had no outlet, no confession, no relief. He was a vessel of dangerous truth, sealed, guarded, isolated. No applause, no record, no statue would bear his likeness. No general would mention him in dispatches. His work, though vital, was designed to vanish the moment it was done. He was the man behind the curtain, behind the whisper, behind the turn of history that no one ever questioned, and that was his purpose, not to be remembered, but to ensure Rome never forgot what mattered most. There were many ways to serve Rome. Some bore shields, some bore scrolls. But the speculator bore something far more delicate. He carried trust, and when that trust broke, the cost was not counted in coin, but in silence, in disappearance, in names never spoken again. Not all missions ended in success. Not all shadows made it home. Discovery was death. The greatest threat to a speculator was not the enemy's sword. He was recognition, the slip of a word, the turn of a phrase. To Roman, or a look to rehearsed. A moment was all it took. Lucius had heard the stories. All speculators had. A man in Cappadocia who crossed himself like a Roman at a Celtic shrine. K. Another who mispronounced a local name once. K. A third who walked with the posture of a trained soldier and caught the eye of an old auxiliary dot. They were found out, dragged into the square, stripped of their disguise, interrogated until their usefulness ran dry, then made examples of, not just to punish, but to terrify. Crucifixion, burning, thrown to animals, or left at the crossroads as a warning. The message was simple. Rome watches, but it is also watched. Before the end came the breaking, but death wasn't always the worst part. Sometimes it was the moments before, the capture, the doubt, the pressure. Lucius had once come within a breath of exposure. A merchant had noticed his accent. A question had lingered too long. He had walked away slowly, smiling, bowing like a humble trader, and vomited in an alley 3 streets away, not from fear of death, but fear of failure. A speculator who was caught didn't just risk himself, he risked the mission, the chain, the other shadows along the web. Failure meant more than death. It meant unraveling. The mind under siege. There was another danger, less visible, more corrosive. Doubt. The longer Lucius served, the more he felt it press against him. A slow, creeping pressure. Not sharp, but constant. He had no one to confide in. No superior who truly understood. No comrade who saw what he saw. Even when the mission ended, he could not speak freely. Not about what he felt. Not about what he feared. He carried secrets too large for his own chest. And over time, the silence grew teeth. Some men cracked. Quietly, subtly, they began to forget names. Misplaced details, lose focus. A few were pulled from the field, reassigned, or simply stopped being mentioned. No one ever said they'd failed. They just disappeared from the web. The burden of Mask's disguise was a tool. How many names had Lucius worn? How many dialects? How many lies? He had wept at fake funerals. He had played the role of grieving brother. He had pretended to fall in love. He had confessed false sins to foreign priests. He had eaten with rebels, toasted with enemies, and said things he never believed with conviction. At times, he wondered where the mask ended and the man began. When you wear so many faces, eventually one of them starts to feel like your own, and that was terrifying. There was no honor in the end, unlike soldiers. A speculator was not mourned publicly. No funeral pyre, no folded banner, no name carved into the stone of remembrance. If he died in the field, his body might never be found. If found, he would not be buried as Roman. He would be seen as the man he pretended to be, a merchant, a thief, a runaway slave, and that. The final concealment, he had died in character. And the empire had let him stay there, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Exposure of identity meant exposure of mission. The silence continued, even after death. The forgotten Lucius. I sometimes thought of them, the others, the ones who hadn't returned, whose last reports were never confirmed, whose trails went cold between provinces. He remembered a man named Sextus, quiet, clever, good with languages. Last seen headed into Hispania under the name Alias, never heard from again. Or a woman named Corina, disguised as a temple acolyte in Cyrene. Her information had helped stop a rebellion. Her reward had been invisibility. Lucius carried there. Memory like hidden coins. Private, valued, never shown. There were no statues of them, but they had shaped the world just the same. Failure was always waiting, even after years of success. Lucius never walked freely. The fear of failure was constant, not paralyzing, but present. It sat in his bones like cold in winter. Every door could hide an enemy. Every drink could be poisoned. Every smile could be fake, and one mistake, just one, could undo a lifetime of careful steps. He accepted it. He carried it, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant becoming something else, something weaker, something visible, and he couldn't afford that. Why he still served, he did not do it for glory. He had seen what glory looked like. It was loud, a temporary, and often bought with other men's pain. Lucius served for something quieter, something steadier to prevent war before it began. To keep peace without show, to ensure that chaos stayed behind the border. It was a hard path, a lonely one, but it was his. And even knowing the cost, the failure that waited, the silence that done, followed the names that vanished, he still chose to walk it, because someone had to. History recalls emperors. It chisels their faces in stone, names cities after them, and commits their orations, their victories, and their battles to paper. Yet the scouts, the quiet ones, the observers, the men with no names, left no monuments. Still, they shaped the empire beneath the surface. More than spies. To label them spies would be too simple. They were observers, messengers, interpreters, and masters of disguise. But more than that, they were keepers of patterns. They understood the pulse of cities. They could read the rhythm of fear. They sensed rebellion days before it sparked into flame. They didn't merely report danger. They anticipated it, redirected it, and sometimes ended it long before it ever reached the ears of the Senate in silence. Rome remained intact. Passing the torch, Lucius grew old. His hands no longer moved quickly, and his back stiffened in the mornings. He still wore the masks of disguise, though each one felt heavier with time. He began to train others. Not in classrooms, there were no academies for the invisible, but in moments, he would notice a young man now and then, with still eyes and a quiet presence. A soldier who didn't boast, a listener. And Lucius would ask a question, not directly, but sideways. If the man answered with the right kind of silence, the teaching would begin, not through lectures, but gestures. A correction here, a map, in the dirt there. Wisdom offered over shared bread, knowledge passed like a flame from candle to candle. And as Rome changed, so too did Lucius. He had no tomb, no lineage, no scroll of honors. But if you listened closely, in the hush of a governor's hesitation, in the unrest of a traitor's conscience, or in the breath held before an uprising that never come, you might feel it. A trace, a fingerprint. A man who left no footprints, but shifted provinces with his presence. He lived among lies, yet never lost the truth. Not the truth of who he was, but of what he served. The living record, some say, only written history endures. But Lucius became something else. He was a living record not of events, but of intentions. He carried not the visible facts of campaigns, but the hidden reasons they succeeded. He was the margin where decisions were made quietly and unseen. Long before speeches were written or generals took credit, his influence could not be cited. Yet it echoed in the confidence of commanders who never knew why they felt safe. Only that they did. The empire of shadows, when Lucius laid down his final mask, nothing in Rome appeared to change. No bells rang. No statues fell. But something had shifted. A space opened. A silence widened. Others stepped in, some loyal, some ambitious, but none quite like him. For Lucius had not served balance. He had served balance, and without balance, even the mightiest empires can tremble. The unwritten map he left no heirs, yet the path he walked still exists. It lives in the instincts of those who observe, in the discipline of those who wait. In the knowing that not every battle is fought with swords, he taught by doing, by enduring, by vanishing well in this way. He became the cartographer of an invisible empire, a land defined not by borders, but by silences, by unanswered questions, dangers avoided, and lives unknowingly saved. Peace. At last, in his final years, Lucius walked slower and spoke even less. Not for lack of words, but because he had learned the truest things rarely require. Them, he watched soldiers march, senators speak, and children play beside stones older than their ancestors, and he smiled. Despite betrayal, fear, and isolation, the empire stood, not because of force, but because of quiet, because of watchers, because of those who protected it from within. Because of men like Lucius, the empire had grown more complex. Threats came from within as much as beyond. Officially, some were called supply officers, handlers of grain and provisioning. Unofficially, they were the new web, less solitary than their predecessors, more political, more visible. Some say they became too loud, too powerful, that they lost the purity of silence. Still, the methods remained. The signals, the disguises, the unseen hand guiding events. Lucius watched this new order emerge. He did not envy them. He did not resent them. He simply nodded and faded further from sight. No. Chronicle bears their names. Scrolls did not preserve their names. No lists, no records. And that was intentional. To know them was to risk everything they had protected. They moved like wind through trees felt, but never caught. Lucius once sat in a tavern and heard a traveler speak of a rebellion that had mysteriously failed to spark. He smiled, but said nothing. He had been to that village 2 weeks earlier. He had silenced it not with blades, but with whispers, with well-placed questions and warnings. In the right ears, at the right time, the traveler toasted the general, who kept the peace. Lucius raised his cup. To no one. A life measured in absence, men like Lucius had no victories, no celebrations, no homecoming. Only the quiet satisfaction of absence. If nothing happened, no riots, no alliances, no intercepted letters, then the mission had succeeded. Success was silence. Success was forgetting. Success was no one remembering you were ever there at all. The mirror remains in his final years. Lucius used no names. He no longer thought of himself as one person. He became a mirror, a reflection of whatever the mission required, a hollow that shaped the world around it. Reflections in dust one night. In a roadside inn, Lucius sat alone. That day, he was an old merchant, his hands slow, his face lined. No one noticed him. No one asked his name. Outside, the wind nudged the shutters. Inside, fire cracked softly in the hearth. He thought of the others. The ones who vanished. The ones who never returned. The ones who died in borrowed names. He remembered them not as ghosts, but as threads woven into a tapestry only shadows could see. He smiled, not with pride, but with peace. He had never asked for glory, only purpose. What remains, the scouts did not leave monuments, but they left an imprint in the silence between victories, in storms that never came, in decisions quietly guided by unseen whispers. They were the ones who kept the story aligned, without ever appearing in its pages. And Lucius T. was never remembered at ease, but because of him, Rome never forgot itself. The ruins of Rome still echo with the footsteps of soldiers, senators, and slaves. Columns lie broken, temples weathered, names of emperors etched deep into stone. But there are no statues of the Watchers, no memorials for the scouts, no public honors for those who gave everything and left nothing behind. They lived in disguise, worked in silence, and vanished without legacy. Without them, many of the stories we remember might never have happened at all. They were not the authors of Rome's glory, but its editors, cutting threats before they reached the stage, rearranging events before they were ever recorded. They were the quiet breath between wars, the hesitation before betrayal, the pause that kept an empire standing. We often remember Rome for what it built, but perhaps we should remember it too for what it prevented. The empire did not survive on strength alone. It survived on awareness, timing, on men like Lucius Mirrors, who never cracked, even when no one was looking. Asterisk if this glimpse into the shadows of ancient Rome intrigued you. Be sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell to uncover more untold stories from the hidden corners of history. History isn't just written by victors, sometimes. It's protected by those who never appear in the record at all. Leave a Comment below to tell us which hidden part of the ancient world you'd like to explore next. And as always, thank you for watching.